Brilliant. So thank you everyone for attending today's final session of our Dr1in4 program. This webinar is being recorded, but don't worry, you will be able to remain anonymous. It's only me, Linda and Subodh who are going to be on screen. So please feel free to use the chat and the Q&A functions to ask questions. You'll remain anonymous through that. I'm Cookie Taylor. I'm Program and Business Development Manager at Doctors in Distress. And we've developed this program with our trustee Subodh to specifically help medical students. So today we're going to be exploring not just surviving, but thriving despite mental illness, focusing on shame, seeking help, and finding your niche. I'm delighted to be here with Professor Linda Gask, Professor of Primary Care Psychiatry and retired Consultant Psychiatrist. And Linda will be interviewed by Professor Subodh Dave, Consultant Psychiatrist and Dean of RCPsych and Doctors in Distress Trustee. And it was Subodh who came up with the concept of Dr1in4, which is a statistic which shows that doctors, medical health professionals will come into a spate of mental health problems in the course of their career. And the point of the Dr1in4 program is indeed to highlight this, but also fundamentally get a culture going of having the confidence to disclose when you or your colleagues are struggling, and to ensure that you are supported as well. So this is why we're here today. For those of you who are unfamiliar with Doctors in Distress, we are an independent charity providing mental health support to all healthcare workers across the UK. We groups which run for 4 to 10 weeks, as well as specialist-led webinars like today, and campaigning for better working conditions for all healthcare workers. We will be sending out evaluation forms for today's session tomorrow. So please, minutes, it may even just take you 60 seconds to complete these forms so that we can use your direct experience to secure further funding to run more of these sessions. So please do fill in those evaluation forms and send them back to us. I think it's just on SurveyMonkey in any case. If you have any questions throughout the session today, please do use the chat or Q&A feature, and we'll do our best to answer these. And social media information in the chat. So please do follow us, like us, share our posts, encourage others to do the same. I'm not au fait with Instagram, but please do what you can to share everything you can about the session. So let's get started for today. Here is the poll. It's just 2 multiple choice questions. Please answer as quickly as you can. I'll give you about 30 seconds to answer the questions, just instantaneously, whatever comes into your mind. So let's just press the button for the polls. There you go. Right, there you go. You should be able to fill that in now. Give you another 10 seconds. Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you very much for your participation. That's wonderful. Great. So just so you know, in terms of the feedback, so for question 1, on a scale of 1 to 5, how concerned are you about stress, burnout, and mental illness in doctors, with 1 being least concerned and 5 being most concerned? The majority of you are number 4, so being most concerned. And then for question 2, on a scale of 1 to 5, how would you rate your confidence in dealing with stress, burnout, and mental illness in doctors, with 1 being least confident and 5 being most confident? It landed in the middle there with 3, but then quickly went up to number 4 as well. So those are the results. Right, so just so you can see that. So over to Linda and Subodh to have their wonderful discussion and interview.
Thank you so much, Cookie, for that introduction. And let me, first of all, thank you, Linda, for agreeing to be a part of this series. You have personally been a very inspirational figure for me as a psychiatrist. You have such an illustrious, biography. You've been professor at the Center of Primary Care at the University of Manchester, and you remain the emeritus professor there. You've done such a huge amount of work, and your textbook on primary care psychiatry is still something that I routinely urge my trainees to read. You've been, an advisor to the World Health Organization, and you developed suicide prevention programs. So a wealth of, clinical and academic accolades. And you've written a book about your experiences of depression. I encounter medical students quite routinely in my line of work. As you know, half my job is to do with undergraduate medical education, and often get medical students nowadays, especially starting with their first clinical post is in psychiatry. And some of them have said to me, well, if you're successful when you're working and doing so well, is that a little bit incompatible with depression? What's your experience been, Linda? Yeah, you're on mute at the moment.
Far from it. People's outward appearance and what they achieve is often at odds with how they feel about themselves. I have felt like an imposter for most of my career. And I think that much of what I've achieved has been driven by the fact that I never felt that I was doing well enough. And people who are often very successful are sometimes driven too hard by that inner demon that keeps saying, you're really not good enough. You're really not good enough at this. You haven't achieved enough. I've met many people like that in my career. I think you can never judge a person by what they appear to have achieved, because their inner self is often telling them a very different story. And I've seen that in colleagues. And I think it's, there are things from my early life that impacted on me that mean I'm still trying to come top of the class. And that's hard to get rid of. And I've seen that. I think that's particularly around in doctors sometimes.
Yes, I think that sense of competitiveness and sense of wanting to do better, even with yourself, is often ingrained. So what about depression and anxiety? Is that something that's part of people's personality? Is that something you're born with? How did this start in your case, Linda?
Well, I started to feel anxious a lot as a teenager. I had extreme anxiety with exams, and tremendous performance anxiety, which was really physical. My parents were both very anxious people. My mother was treated for anxiety by the GP, and my father, I think, got depressed. There were times when he was very down. My brother has OCD. So I think there's some genetic factors that predisposed me. But I'm aware that my early life probably triggered off some of that, in that it was quite stressful growing up in a household with someone with really severe OCD. And my anxiety really focused around performing and examinations, and that followed me to medical school, where it carried on. And I first really, I think it's not unusual for mood problems to start with anxiety at that age, but by the time I got into my 20s, I actually started to experience depression as well. And I had my first real episode of that when I was studying for finals, and I kind of went beyond anxiety and actually got very low.
Gosh.
And then that's happened intermittently throughout my life. A lot of the time when I'm feeling well, and I've been pretty well now for the last 4 or 5 years, when I'm feeling well, it's kind of hard to imagine myself back into feeling that way. But it's very definitely there. It comes and goes. These days, I probably only have bad days rather than bad weeks and months. And a lot of that's to do with different stresses in my life now.
Right. It's interesting that you mentioned that it's hard to imagine how it is when you are depressed. And I wonder whether you could try and paint a picture of what is it like to be depressed, because in a sense we all have, I mean, it's almost impossible for you to be an adult and not have had first degree contact with depression directly or indirectly, I think someone very close to you or in yourself. But yet I imagine that it's difficult even then to put yourself in the shoes of somebody who's actually very depressed, isn't it?
It is. I think the key thing for me is, well, there are physical symptoms that very often are the early warning signs that I'm getting unwell, not being able to sleep, right. Abdominal pains, getting up in the night, feeling extremely agitated. I get physically extremely agitated. But my mood, I start to ruminate about negative things. The worst is going to happen. Something I'm worried about, it's all going to go wrong. Very negative ruminations. And I have no energy. I get extremely tired.
Right.
And I start to feel hopeless and really despairing. And it's really difficult. It's hard for anything to cheer me up. When I've been at my worst, I've found it hard to get out of bed in the morning, maybe get out of bed middle of the afternoon, if at all, and feel better towards the evening. And in the evening, I start to think about the things I'm going to do the next day to shake myself out of this. And then when the next day comes, I can't do them. And there's been times when that pattern has gone on for weeks in the past.
I mean, that sounds soul crushing, isn't it? I think when you're planning to do something and it doesn't happen.
Yes.
And then happens again.
It's the repetitiveness of every day. When you can't summon up any enthusiasm for anything. You can only think about bleak things and see the worst in everything. And
the sheer effort of it sounds quite exhausting as well, because to even put in that effort to think about things must be like climbing a mountain.
When I've been really unwell, I can't switch my computer on. I can't actually engage with things that I would normally be involved in. I remember being physically unable to switch it on. I was so anxious.
Gosh.
I can't concentrate. I find it hard to read because I can't concentrate. And I spent my life reading and writing. So that sort of sense of being completely just disengaged from my usual self. I generally have lost weight. I have had periods when I've lost quite a lot of weight.
Wow.
Not so much in latter years, but that's been part of it too.
So quite a few different symptoms, isn't it? And I think as you've been describing that picture, Linda, I haven't asked you this question before, but I mean, it sounds like it must be very difficult for you, but it probably is difficult for people around you as well.
It is. My husband, I mean, he's very good at pointing out when I'm getting unwell, and I don't necessarily believe him.
Right.
And one of the things that he notices is that I start to ruminate about things. And that rumination, I guess, is probably related to the obsessional anxiety that there is in my family. But I will ask him the same thing many, many times. And that for him is the warning sign. But it's also really hard for him. I know, because it's not possible to reassure me.
No, and you are seeking that all the
yeah.
time, and it's
Yes.
not possible for him to do that.
Yes.
Or to reason with you, I guess, because
yeah,
I guess that's another thing that people
difficult.
try and do, isn't it?
Yes. And there have been times, I mean, I think there have been times when I've been a bit paranoid as well. I wouldn't say deluded, but I've certainly found myself retreating from the world and starting to feel that, you know, everything's against me. And there's sometimes been a kind of a kernel of a basis for that when I've had problems at work, but it's become much, much bigger.
And that is also not such an unlikely scenario, right? Because I think if you are depressed, as you've described, your energy levels are low, and you're probably doubting yourself, and you're not very confident, and so you are self-conscious, but then you're also possibly likely to notice other things that you wouldn't otherwise notice, and then it's kind of a cycle where people are actually noticing you because you are being a bit different. And so it's not a fanciful imagination. It's actually happening. People are looking at you and wondering what's going on.
Yes.
But they're not approaching you and saying anything. And then so you're left wondering, well, what are they thinking?
I do get irritable when my mood isn't right. And that has caused me problems in the past. I don't have much patience. So I get into arguments with people. And I know that's one of the things that caused me problems in my work over the years. Most of the time, I'm actually reasonably patient, but when my mood isn't right, I lose that. And that's another thing my husband picks up on. I start to get a bit challenging at times.
Right. So what has been the most challenging period illness-wise for you then, Linda?
It was a time when I'd been a consultant for about 3 years, and there were a lot of difficulties where I was working, and I was struggling to keep things afloat. I completely exhausted myself, and I wasn't getting much support, and I went off sick, and I was off sick for about 6 months.
Right.
And I really did feel pretty hopeless then. I think that was probably the worst time in terms of actually feeling unwell. The other really challenging time was when I was a junior doctor and I failed my membership exam.
Gosh.
And I felt completely hopeless then. And
just to interject, I mean, pass rate is around 50% anyway. We know that.
Yeah.
But you felt very, very hopeless.
I did, because everybody expected me to pass it.
Right.
And my colleagues passed it. Where I was training, I was surrounded by people who generally passed the exam.
Right.
And it was a pretty awful time, because I felt very there's something very public about it. And I already had what would now be a specialist registrar appointment without having passed the exam. I'd already been appointed to that job, and I couldn't see a way forward. And I think that's the time when I probably came closest to thinking about ending it. But I didn't. But it was that terrible sense of shame and humiliation, really.
Yeah, and I think that shame is a very strong emotion, isn't it? And I think
it is.
It's probably, we don't talk about it, and actually it doesn't feature in the diagnostic criteria as such, but it comes up pretty much in every clinical conversation I have. That sense of shame.
I think it's particularly powerful when people reach a point where they start to think that they can't go on.
Yes. What helped you at that point of time, and when you reached that stage?
A couple of things, really. My boss was Professor of Psychiatry, who had a reputation for being a very difficult man, and he's no longer with us, so I can say that. But he was actually really supportive, and he said, "What do you need?" and made sure that I got time. And the evening that we had found out the results, we were due to go to a Christmas dinner.
Right.
And he actually came and picked me up from home and took me.
Wow.
And
that's amazing.
He took care of me in that sense. And then a colleague actually started to talk to me and said, "How are you?" I think she picked up, it was in a psychotherapy supervision group, and I think she picked up that I wasn't very well. And I remember saying to her, "What do you do when you actually think you feel worse than some of your patients?" And she arranged for me to get seen by somebody. She was older than us. She'd already trained in a different specialty, and she was very wise. And in fact, it's the boss who helped me. Mm-hmm. He had me coaching other people who'd failed the exam years later. He said, "Your experience will be very helpful." So I actually helped a couple of other people who'd failed to get through and have successful careers.
I mean, there's almost always a way of converting adversity into an opportunity, isn't there? But I think it's hard to see that when you are.
Yeah, depressed. It was interesting. It was when I had an academic post, and he said, "I think you're the right person to help these people."
So Linda, you described this phase and where two people, particularly you single them out, who helped you. I think but when people are depressed, they often feel very lonely, isn't it? And I think there's a reluctance to go out and seek help. I mean, in this case, you had that social capital, you had these people who kind of sought you out. How should people deal with that sense of loneliness? I mean, have you experienced it yourself, that sense of loneliness?
I have. I've often felt quite alone in my life. And I know what it's like to want to shut yourself away and not to interact. And I'm aware that people have tried to get me out and to contact me. And I just think it's really important that when people try, to not push everyone away. When I first came to live here, I was in danger of shutting myself away, and a neighbour just started to come round and bring her dog round and just said, "Let's go for lunch." And that was just so important, because it would have been so easy just to shut yourself away in a tower. But I would find that the easiest thing in the world. It's very easy to do that if you have my kind of temperament, I think.
I think that's an important message, really. And I think those who are attending, I think it's worth whether you have depression yourself or whether we come across people who have depression. I think it's that sense of personal connection, isn't it? That's important. And I think I think I have certainly found that people, I mean, I had this personal experience myself. I think not long before we had our conversation in Derby, Linda, I'd had an injury in my ankle, and I was walking around in crutches for a few days. And I kid you not, at least about 50 people must have stopped me in the corridors asking me what happened, what happened, why are you in crutches? But literally a few months before then, and you probably know Professor Subodh Dave, who was my mentor and dear colleague, and he'd passed away, and I was quite upset by it. And I sent a note around, to my team saying that, look, I might be a bit off for the next few days. And only 2 people kind of wrote back, saying anything, And I think, and I wonder whether there's a sense of awkwardness that people experience in approaching you. And have you experienced that? Have you seen that people don't know what to say or how to say things to you?
Yes. I mean, I've experienced that myself with people, but I don't find it as difficult because I think I understand what it's like.
Sure.
But I have seen, I mean, when I've had long periods off work, when I did have long periods off work, very few people contacted me. That's certainly true. But the people who did were people who did actually care. And that's something to remember, really. They've made a big effort to get in touch with you.
And I think, as you say, it's not that difficult. I mean, I think it's just about keeping in mind, isn't it? It's about paying attention, isn't it? I think it's about, I think what Arthur Miller says is the biggest gift you can give is of gift of attention. I think it's just paying attention to someone else. I think, and then it's just a very normal thing that you would say, well, how are you? Can you have a cup of tea, or do you want me to? Is there anything I can do? Or just literally dropping a line to say, well, how are you doing? But people find it awkward, I think,
Yes, I think people do find it awkward. I think people find anything to do with feelings very awkward sometimes. They think that's private, and they're also a bit concerned whether you'll say, leave me alone. But if people do say, leave me alone, leave them alone for a little bit and then try again. And
I mean, in that sense, that's something that we as medics are almost trained to do, to ask awkward questions. I remember, when I've moved from India to the UK, and then in India, well, it may have been, but I don't know. It wasn't such a, you didn't expect drug misuse so commonly, so you'd probably direct your questions to a few people. But here, I mean, I was trained to ask that question to each one every time, and I think, and then you think that, well, asking a 90-year-old woman about cannabis misuse seems awkward, but then you realize that the awkwardness lies within you. And I think once you figure out how to overcome that, then you ask the question quite naturally, and then it becomes a conversation, and the 90-year-old person reacts and responds, understands, that you are sincerely trying to do a decent job, and I think, so certainly as medics we can train it, but even before then, and this is a very human thing to do. It's not something that we really, in some ways, require training for. To reach out to someone is a very human thing, and it's kind of innate to all of us, isn't it?
Yes, I think something happens during medical training, though, where we sometimes forget that we're human, and we start to think that we have to ask technical questions of people. Correct. Whereas we just forget to say something like, how are you?
So I mean, Linda, you managed a successful career. I think people, I found, are quite reluctant sometimes to share information about their illness. And to be fair, I think, though we have in this country disability discrimination laws, etc., the reality is more complex, isn't it? I think it's not as if you don't experience discrimination. I think if you have mental illness, you probably do experience discrimination. How have you dealt with that? I mean, is that something you experience, and how have you negotiated that?
I did experience it a bit during my work. I think I sometimes had a reputation for being a difficult person because there were times when I wasn't 100% well. And I'm aware that sometimes people were wanting to push me to make decisions that I didn't think were right for me. And I think in retrospect, they should have been better at recognizing that I wasn't well when I was behaving in a particular way. And you think that within psychiatry that wouldn't happen, but it does.
It does.
Absolutely. And so I always find, my work career very easy. I had some really, really good managers over the years who were great. But there were one or two people I worked with who I just find it fascinating how people can have a public face of being empathic about mental illness, but in everyday work are absolutely the opposite. And I've worked with people like that. So there were difficulties, and I had to have time off work very often just to get away from those difficulties. And I felt terribly guilty about being off, but I wasn't fit to work. And I think if I'd carried on trying to work, I would have got myself into deeper messes, which is what I've observed, sometimes people do. And it's been good. I've had good medical care. I've had doctors who, particularly from occupational health, who helped me navigate some of those experiences. I don't think I wouldn't say any adjustments have ever been made for me, or I've needed them, but I have needed to find myself in a job where I had a certain amount of freedom to do what was best for me. And that's not always easy.
No. I think it's interesting you mentioned occupational health, because I think that in my experience as well, that's quite a helpful way of dealing with things, because then they are able to advise you and your employers on the best way to negotiate both your mental illness and your work. But we all know, and the statistics are there for all to see, that doctors are particularly reluctant to seek help. The culture in medicine is such. I mean, the reason why I started this Dr1in4 program is because, we all know that going into medicine, you will come across mortality, morbidity, you will come across stress, and yet there's no way of preparing you for it, and I think people stumble into finding the right course for them. It's not as if they're prepared to deal with this. I think certainly, a better understanding of your occupational health system in your workplace would help, I think, and disclosing to someone early on would help. But the figures are all to say that disclosure rates are very, very low. People really are reluctant to disclose. I think we had a colleague of mine, Deep, speak about substance misuse earlier in the series. So we know that people with fairly severe problems, whether it's due to substance misuse or mental illness, can actually have a successful career. So it's not at all incompatible. And the success rates actually for doctors are quite good if you seek help, but yet there is a big reluctance to seek help fairly early on. What helped you, I think, in actually seeking help? Was it just the severity of your illness, or was there also some other factor that helped you?
I think it was probably the severity of my illness. I think the fact that I just couldn't work.
Right.
I'd reached a point where I couldn't function. And I've seen people who've tried to go on past that point. I worked too long on a couple of occasions. I should have stopped sooner, but I think I just couldn't couldn't go on. I couldn't function in the workplace. You know, I was crying, I was distressed, agitated, argumentative, and I couldn't be there in the end. But I should have gone earlier. I should have sought help earlier on a couple of occasions. I know that. I think my husband and colleagues learned how to get me to stop sooner. But it is hard. I mean, I wasn't very public about my mental health problems, but I had to be, in that you know, when you're going through revalidation, you have to be open about your health, and I had to be open about my health, and I had to discuss what I was doing and the fact that I was getting care. So, you know, I think you have a responsibility to look after your own health in order to be able to care for other people's. I couldn't focus on the work that I was doing because I was too focused on my inner turmoil when I was in that state. Yeah,
that's a good way of looking at it, isn't it? That unless you are looking after yourself, then you are in no condition to look after someone else. You know?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I got help. I got a lot of help from my GP, who was brilliant. That was at the time when there was more continuity of care with the GP, and I knew someone over a long period of time. And it was great because he knew what I was like when I was well. So when I saw him when I was unwell, he knew, he could tell the difference. And I had care from a couple of psychologists over the years in therapy, and a couple of psychiatrists, 3 psychiatrists, I think, over the years. I do think that getting to know a doctor over time, or a therapist over time, is important, because if they only meet you when you're in a state like I was in, they don't realize who you can be.
Correct.
And that was important for me.
So Linda, you've been quite open about being prescribed medication and you taking medication. I know, having dealt with lots of colleagues, that for some people it's almost that's a big barrier. You know, I think there's almost a sense that if it's depression, I must deal with it through my own willpower, which to me as a scientist seems a bit strange, because, you know, I never think about that I must walk from Birmingham to London, because I shouldn't rely on trains, because that's somehow relying on some other source. But when it comes to mental health, we all fall into that trap, isn't it, of saying that, well, I must rely on willpower, I must not take medication, I must not seek external help, it must be something I must do internally. What's your sense? I mean, both as a psychiatrist and on the other side, I mean, why do we have this dilemma within ourselves?
I think there's still a view, and it's certainly around in mental health, that somehow you should suffer and you should go through your suffering, and that something positive will come out of the other end. That's all very well, unless you're in such a state that your suffering might actually end your life. And if you're going nowhere with your mood, even with therapy, then there comes a point where I think you've nothing to lose from trying medication. I mean, I didn't have antidepressants until I was 35.
Right.
And that was quite a long time after my first episode. I'd been given benzos, which I wasn't very impressed with, because my mother had been on benzos for her anxiety.
Right.
And I knew that they were addictive, and I didn't want to stay on them. But in the end, I actually went and asked my doctor if I could try antidepressants. And he gave them to me, and I got better. And I had got better with therapy before, but it took a long time. And I was actually able to return to therapy much faster because I'd been on antidepressants, and I was able to do some work that I don't think I could have done unless I'd been considerably better in an ability to concentrate. So I did go back to therapy when I was on medication. It's strange. I mean, I sometimes wonder who the real me is, whether the real me is the person who's not on medication or the person who is.
Right.
All I can say is I wouldn't have got any of the amount of work I've done in my life done if I'd have not been on medication.
Well, that's interesting. You described it like that, the real me, I think, and I guess in a way that's a question of life for all of us, isn't it? And what is the real you? I think we all actually do change as time progresses. What I mean? I don't recognize myself from the time when I was a medical student and the way I saw the world then. I remember watching the play Look Back in Anger. I don't know that you've John Osborne, the whole idea of angry young man. And I watched that as a young medical student in India, and I felt so much in sync with this young angry man.
Angry young man.
Angry young man. I could feel experience the angst. And then I had the opportunity of watching the play again a few years ago. And I thought, well, what a prat, why is he behaving like that with his girlfriend? So we all do change, and I think it's what is the real you? It's difficult to answer that question.
It's really hard. I mean, there were certainly times when I had some quite dramatic mood shifts when I was younger, because I was going through quite a bit of stuff in my life to do with relationships and to do with how I felt about myself and the end results of my childhood. But I feel much, much better now. And I'm still on antidepressants. And whenever I talk about coming off them, everyone says don't. I probably will stay on them. But I'm okay on them. And I have side effects, but it's not as bad as how I felt at times in the past.
I guess a related question, Linda, is that, and we said this in our introduction. In fact, the question that Cookie put up talked about stress, burnout, and mental illness. And I think, in my mind, I think people often, it all gets kind of becomes one single entity, and I guess when you're going through it, I mean, if I take you back to your first episode or the first couple of years when you're feeling like that, it's probably quite difficult to decipher or decide as to whether you're stressed or whether you're burnt out or whether you're depressed. Does it really matter what you call it? Or
I think we probably call some things burnout that we should call depression. I have been stressed by situations, but I've been able to function when I've been away from them. I've gone on holiday and I've been able to enjoy my holiday. When I've been burned out, I've gone on holiday and I've slept my entire holiday. And when I've been depressed, I have been burned out, and then I've gone on to start feeling negative about the whole world. And so I think it's a matter of degree. My husband said to me the other week, do you remember when we were in such and such? Of course you wouldn't, because you were asleep. And I've spent so many holidays asleep on sofas in really nice places because I was so exhausted. And that's burnout. And it's a way of functioning, but depression is worse.
That's right. And I think it's helpful to recognize that there are those treatable mental illnesses, and I think which where very severe can actually have fairly devastating consequences. And I think you really want to recognize that and act on it. And I guess sometimes now, I especially medical students now, many universities have started those well-being days or well-being resources, and I think sometimes people find them a bit overwhelming and a little bit trite and patronizing even. I do feel that there needs to be that distinction between kind of it's all a spectrum, but I think clearly there is a severe end of the spectrum, which is where I guess seeking help early and then getting into treatment helps. And I think it's about recognizing that, and sometimes if you can't recognize it, getting help to recognize it is important, isn't it?
Yes. People need to. You need to listen to what people are saying around you. It's hard, and sometimes you just want to reject it, but I think you do need to listen.
So, Linda, we've talked about, you touched upon this in about what others can do, and then you just said that you need to listen to what can other people do. I mean, what would your advice be to them? I think what might have helped you when you're depressed? Well, what could have others around you have done differently? I think
I was fortunate in that I did have a couple of friends when I was a medical student who did say, "Are you okay?" But I think that I didn't always want to take notice of them, but they were there and they did ask those things. And I think it's important to just be able to be prepared to say to someone who doesn't seem to be coping with things, or is avoiding things, or isn't getting out of bed in the morning, "How are things? Are you okay? Do you want to talk about it?" It's just something like that can really matter. After my father died, I was in a really bad state, and I do remember a medical student friend just saying, "Do you want to talk about it?" And then I spent the whole afternoon with her. But she actually said that, and that was so important.
That is powerful, isn't it? I think, and
yeah,
I think it's easy for us to forget that power that we have within us of actually making a difference to someone else's life directly. And I think I certainly am very aware of that, even more so now that I've become dean, is that we all have these roles that enable us to operate on a bigger canvas, but it's easy to forget that we have a real power of making a direct difference to somebody else's life, one-on-one. And I think that is incredible that we have that power within us, and I think how do we exercise that, and how do we use that, how do we recognize that is so important. And I think it is. Yeah. And I think especially us being in medicine, I think it really is something, and we should be doing that with our patients, and with our colleagues. I think it's something that we can easily do, and I think we shouldn't forget to not lose that, but not lose that power.
Yeah, absolutely.
So Linda, I wanted to mention your books. I think you've written these 2 books. Well, first of all, tell us about how was it writing your first book? I mean, it's obviously quite incisive analysis of your own life, really, I think, and how did you find that, The Other Side of Silence?
It was therapy, really. I had stopped seeing a psychotherapist at the time, and I'd always wanted to write, and I started to write memoir, and I started to do it as an exercise, really. And I found it helpful. So I started to take it seriously, and I went on courses, and I went on holidays to write. And it was helpful for me, and it gave me a space to reflect on what being a doctor meant to me. And how there were really, the thing that came to my mind was there were so many parallels between the kind of problems that I was facing and the problems that my patients had faced over the years. And that was the most powerful message that came out of it. And at the time, I felt quite strongly that there was a big stigma about doctors talking about mental health problems, particularly psychiatrists, in that, I've had members of my own family who've said, "Surely you can work it out, you know, you're a psychiatrist.
Yeah.
And and yeah, I found, but I did find it helpful writing. I think writing is a good thing to do, unless you can get stuck writing about the same thing over and over. And I did for a while, and but I managed to move on. And you have to sort of separate yourself from the writing. And then after I retired, I started to think maybe I should try and publish it. And so that's what I did. I had to sort of stand apart from it and get an editor to work on it, and then I managed to get it published.
Well, congratulations! It's a good book, and I certainly recommend it to our listeners today. Have a look. I think if you Google it, "The Other Side of Silence," you'll find it. The other one, I have to confess, I haven't still read it, Linda. Finding True North. I do have the copy, but haven't yet managed to read that. So tell me. I've read the blurb and I've kind of skimmed through it, so I know what's it about. And it's about finding. I'm quite fascinated by that, being a migrant myself, because where is home is a complex question. I think, and depending on who asks me the question and in what context they ask me, I come up with a different answer.
Well, I had actually. I was still feeling quite chronically low when I retired, and I came to live here, and I decided to really have a go at doing all the things that I've been telling other people to do for years, in terms of changing their lifestyle and trying to work their life out and trying mindfulness and everything else. And in the course of doing that, I actually started to think about lots of different things about what recovering from depression actually means. What does it mean to recover? And what do you have to do? And I really realized, there were certain things in my life that I had to revisit that I had never revisited. I'd never been to where my father's ashes were scattered. And which I did, and that actually was really therapeutic. But I wouldn't have done those things if I hadn't have been starting to think about this and writing. So it was a thinking process as well as writing, and it took me back in time, but it also helped me to think about where I wanted to go in my life. I think retiring and giving up work when work's been so important in your life, it's kind of hard to think, what am I going to do now? Medicine has a habit of taking over your life, and I think it's really important to prevent it from doing that.
I think that's such an important message, actually, Linda, because I totally identify with that, because it can easily take everything over, isn't it? And I think having something that reminds you that life is not just all about your work in medicine is so important. So your book, again, this book is available, and so do have a look at that. What has been the feedback to your book? I mean, have people come back to you and said things? Because I can imagine.
Yes. I mean, people have been really positive, particularly about the first one. A lot of students found that helpful because I wrote about my experience of being a medical student and seeking help. And the second one, I've had less feedback. It's not been as successful as the first one, but that's fine. It was written for a purpose, and some people have found it helpful in terms of thinking about where they're at in their life, which is what I was doing. I'm now working on another book, which is to do with. I'm working on a book to do with women's mental health, and something I've been fascinated with all my life, which is women and mental health. And that's actually set me off interviewing lots and lots of women, which I'm able to do now on Zoom from here.
Right.
And so I've been exploring other people's stories and trying to make sense of that. So that's
Although
That's in progress.
That sounds really fascinating, and I think I'll be really interested from a cross-cultural perspective as well. I think certainly that's one of the things I noticed moving from India to the UK, that it's a far more liberating experience for women than it is for men. I think, you know, I mean, I have to shamefully acknowledge that growing up as a man in India was a very different experience. You know, I think it was a very unequal experience. I knew that my sisters and, you know, women around me were being treated very differently to the way I was being treated. You know, I think so. No, I look forward to that. That'll be quite interesting. There are a couple of questions from the audience, Linda, and I think the first one is from Deep. I think it might be Deep, whom I know. Said that it was way back in '96, June, July, when he was a medical student with you in the Northwest. He wasn't right at the time. We're just checking where your mental health was at the time, '96. I don't know if you can remember that. But he said that he was trying to avoid contact with you as the boss, and Euro '96 and the missed penalty provided good excuse. But remember you being great, and that placement confirmed to him that he wanted to be a psychiatrist, and he's been a consultant in addictions.
Yes.
Hello.
Hi. I wasn't great at the time. I was struggling, but we had just started to have medical students in Preston, which was great, and I was putting a lot of effort into trying to make it good for the students.
I have to say, Linda, that you must have done, because I mean, Deep is one. Certainly he speaks highly of you, but I have independently had people come up to me and say how good a teacher you were, and that I think for a teacher, for the student to hear that from a student is the best, you know, best feedback you can ever get.
That's lovely.
No, so it's really, really good. The next question is, have you experienced colleagues or people close to you feeling that you're not entitled to feel anxiety if you've been successful or achieved well in the past? I think I kind of touched upon that right at the beginning, that stop stressing, you're always fine. It's annoying for people. I can imagine that, well, you know, this is almost like you are in a privileged place and you are also talking about depression. How does that work? So which is probably quite a difficult place to negotiate that, isn't it?
Yeah, I also think there's something about being a woman there as well, that I do think that if women get distressed, sometimes it's written off as being, you're just stressing out, you're just being a bit silly. And I don't think we're always taken as seriously as we should be. And, you know, there are things that happen to women medical students that can be really unpleasant. I know they happen because people have told me about them. Sure. And you're just kind of told, just get on with it, you know, just don't make a fuss about it, and don't get upset about it. And I don't think we should ever play down someone's distress, because you never really know what underlies it.
I think that's a good point, isn't it? I think even from a non-hierarchical point of view, we often have this idea that we're looking at somebody else's life, and I think this is particularly true now with social media, isn't it? And I think I'm as guilty as everyone else, you know, putting in pictures of my sourdough breads and whatnot, you know. I think when you do that, people kind of sometimes have a view that your life is hunky-dory, you know, it's just full of these wonderful breads and holidays and in exotic places, and that's all that is there to your life. And I think it's a fantasy we all can indulge in relation to other people. But the reality is that life is difficult, you know, and I think we all have our own little distresses, and for some those distresses are more than others, and it's really got not much to do with what your successes in other branches of life may be. Yeah.
I think we have to acknowledge, though, that, you know, I'm in a fortunate place now in that I'm able to live better than my own parents lived, and I don't face the economic difficulties they faced when I was growing up. But that doesn't stop me finding things to stress about, and people assume that you don't have them. You do. You just have different things that you worry about.
Well, Linda, thank you so much. I think I'm going to try and draw to a close, but is there anything you'd like to offer as advice to medical students who are embarking on a career? I think you talked about people sometimes getting stuck in a niche or kind of predetermining a path, but anything else, anything that you want to give as final advice, piece of wisdom from you?
Just don't be ashamed to ask for help, because we all need help at some point or another. I don't know anyone who doesn't depend on other people. And get it sooner rather than later, because if you leave it longer, things get worse. And the thing I feel strongly about is don't pretend to be someone that you're not. It's very easy to do that in medicine. You feel that you've got to put a front on. A lot of us spend quite a lot of our time acting. Be yourself, because ultimately, being yourself is often the best medicine for other people.
Very powerful messages, both of them. I think, Linda, I think really is so important to be yourself. I mean, to be fair, it does sometimes take time to kind of figure out who yourself, what yourself is. And I think that's where your first point about asking for help, I think, is really helpful, because it's a struggle for us to sometimes talk to other people, isn't it? And I think
it is.
I think, especially in medicine, it's quite hard. But even in general, I think the culture of individualism has been so strongly ingrained, certainly for the last few decades, that we forget. And I think that's what you said. I mean, it's interdependence really, rather than independence, isn't it? And I think how we have to see ourselves as a part of a community, part of a larger group.
But don't be ashamed to be who you are.
Yeah.
And I think, quite a lot of people are privileged, but don't be ashamed to be who you are. And if you're not from that kind of background, you have advantages as well.
Right. Thank you so much, Linda. I don't think there are any other questions. Cookie, is there, can I invite you back to end this? But Linda, big thanks. I mean, you're always so generous with your time and your experience and your wisdom, and always learn something new from you. And so thank you again. And I look forward to meeting you in person, but I hope I can make it down up to Orkneys. Actually, it'll be nice to kind of meet up with you there. So hopefully soon.
Excellent. Thank you so much, both. That was an amazing experience for me to hear so much about your life, and thank you so much for sharing such personal details. And I look forward to hearing how, upon reflection from the evaluation forms the audience are going to fill in, just how we may have an impact further to help many more people. So thank you, Linda. Thank you, Subodh, as well, for your time and for coming up with the Dr1in4 program as well. I've added contact details to the chat. Yes, if you have any questions, website, Instagram, and various media. But thank you all for coming. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you all.
Thank you.